Lascan Corla, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak on this bill, which, although others have described it as a technical bill, nevertheless opens up an opportunity for us to have a discussion on this really important area of not just of economic activity, but also of artistic endeavour and artistic activity in our country. And I welcome the Minister's commitment, as is clear from his speech in introduction of this bill, that we'll continue as a government to foster this hugely important area for our society and for our community. To say nothing of the business aspect and the economic aspect, which I'll return to in a moment. I don't think we can for a moment, and nobody has in the debate, the vital importance of the audiovisual sector to our country. A number of colleagues have mentioned the fact that I think the sector employs now upwards of 6,000 people, certainly well over 5,500 people. And that, I think we should reflect, is essentially as a direct consequence of state support for this vital area of activity. And that's an important thing for us to reflect on at a time when there's a lot of debate about the role of the state and whether the state should be involved in fostering commercial activity of this or that kind, or whether some people's views and some people's political views are essentially that the state should stay out of all of these things. It should stay out of the economy. And the film industry and the audiovisual industry, Lascan Corla is an example, a living example of the great achievements, in fact, that we've had in this country, from prudent investment through different instruments, whether it's through tax relief or direct funding and so on, attracting outside funding and so forth. It's a hugely important achievement in the, 30 years or more since the Irish Film Board was set up in 1980. And some colleagues have very generously referred to the towering work of the then Deputy or Minister Michael D. Higgins, now President of Ireland, in the 1990s. And I certainly just would like to reflect on some of the things that happened in the 1990s briefly, if I may. But I think it's probably no harm, given the sort of generous creature that I am, Lascan Corla, to say that others too have in the past, perhaps in different circumstances and in a different context, also made an important contribution. For example, the former Taoiseach Charles Haughey was one person who did bring forward, I think, a lot of this thinking in relation to the arts, in relation to film. And the Film Board was set up in 1980. I think it's no harm, because there aren't usually too many opportunities for us to perhaps note the positive achievements of some of our predecessors in this chamber, but that certainly was one. I think it was an important one. But definitely it is true that in the 1990s we had a veritable flowering of activity in this area of the creative industries, as they're sometimes broadly described as. I think we had the sort of the disappearance and then the reintroduction of the Film Board happened during that period. But more importantly, we had the bringing forward of other agencies, like, for example, RTE. RTE were put at the centre of a lot of this activity, quite rightly, in the 1990s, in my view. There was the requirement for a certain amount of funding, RTE's own funding, to be identified and set aside for funding independent productions. I think that was a progressive move. There was the expansion of the tax incentive scheme that we know about in 1993. There was an EU involvement from the media programme during the 1990s as well. And there was also the establishment of Television Gaeilge in the 1990s. And these were all hugely important elements of the flowering of this area of activity and the flowering of creativity, and the business consequences of that and the employment consequences of that were enormous. And I think we'd all agree that it's a crowded, noisy world at the moment in terms of media, radio, television, new media, mobile media, online content. We don't just have a proliferation now of new products, but we have a proliferation of new formats and new types of media, and sometimes it's very difficult to actually keep up with the developments that are going on. So it's all the more important, it seems to me, and I think this is an objective shared by the Minister and by the Government, is that we take every opportunity we can to encourage Irish talent and to encourage the talent that we have here to make Irish films for an Irish audience. And that's what we, I think, have sought to do with the Film Board, and have sought, I think, with very considerable success over the years. And I think that we've all agreed that it's vitally important for the state to extend this kind of support wherever we can, in whatever format we can. But we also need to remember, Lascan Corla, that when we talk about the audiovisual sector, of course, it's not actually just confined to film. it's much more expansive. As I made the point, it's a noisy world. There's so much going on. There's so much activity and so many different types of media. Writing, for example, commercials, corporate video production, which is a very successful line of activity for many people. Audio production. There was a time when there was very little independent radio production and audio production, but that's now actually increased. And then digital content production companies, which have expanded hugely in recent years. I'm sure the Minister will be aware. And I think we need to, when we look at the audiovisual sector, we need to be sure that we're not confining our own horizons when we look to see what help we can give. That even if we extend an area that I've heard other colleagues in the House here referring to the importance of is the digital gaming sector. Now, I know that perhaps is slightly outside the remit of what the Minister is attending to at the moment, but that is also an area of great expansion, and it's an area where people can have creative talent and can actually translate that into something that will actually be a successful business and can actually employ people. So all of the objectives and recommendations, for example, in the Creative Capital report, I would suggest and hope that they would encompass and they would comprehend all of these additional areas and new areas that have come on stream, perhaps since the early days of the Film Board back in 1980, when we spoke about the audiovisual sector, we really just did mean film. Because radio really was confined just to RTE radio at that stage, and we didn't have the sort of proliferation that we've had since. And I do support the recommendations of the Creative Capital report. I think they're very progressive. I think they're important. For example, one of it's recommended that the board's mandate would be extended to act as a specialist development agency for the industry, so to expand its horizons. And one area that's particularly dear to my heart, Las Ciancorla, which I think is extremely important, that the board would have a responsibility for training and talent development. And that's hugely important in this sector, because I think the Minister made the point himself in his speech that something like 70%, it's a very labour-intensive business, the audiovisual sector. I think the Minister said something like 70% of the costs of each production go in labour. And it's hugely important if we want to promote excellence in the sector, that we promote training and education, and young people, for example, in particular, who have talent and have an interest and want to improve their expertise and so on, that we actually work in the education sector. And we have had huge improvements again in 30 years. If you look what's happened, some people mentioned Ballyfermot. Absolutely, I think Ballyfermot College, I think it was my colleague Deputy Conaghan and perhaps others mentioned it. Incredibly progressive, important opportunity for young people to foster their talent and to move forward. And that's been extremely successful. But there have been others as well, as I'm sure colleagues will acknowledge, that have come along in the past 30 years. And we need
2 minutes remaining, Deputy.
Thank you, Las Ciancorla. We need to work to improve, again, to promote and to foster excellence, and to provide the opportunity as best we can to encourage talent and to foster talent and to promote and develop talent. It's not something that we can, it's something that's inherent, that inheres in an individual in the first place, a talent, whether it's a talent to paint a picture, to make a film, to write an essay, write an article, write a book. The talent is something that inheres in the individual, but the responsibility on us as a society and as a government is to do everything we can to promote that and to support it. And that costs money. And I heard some criticism, I don't know whether it was Deputy McGrath, every now and again, I suppose you have to pay some attention to him because as a colleague, but I mean, to criticise the capital programme in relation to the Minister's Department, I think is unfair. And if you look at all the cuts across the board that have had to occur, I think in fact the department has done relatively well in the current context. And I hope that, I'm sure the Minister will fight as hard as he can for all of the different heads of budget that he presides over. But I think that the criticism there was perhaps unfair when you consider the wider threats that exist to all of the funding for all government activity at the moment. There are a couple of other issues that, if I had more time, that I wouldn't mind looking at, Las Ciancorla, perhaps another day. The tax incentive, I mean, the section 481 is up for review again, I think, in 2015. And like all the tax expenditures, they have to be looked at very, very closely. Now, I'm in favour of continuing, but in common with all of the other tax expenditures, it has to be scrutinised very, very, very carefully. And I know in the Commission on Taxation, whereas the Commission on Taxation did support the continuation of the relief, they did point out that the Indicon review in 2007, they were somewhat sceptical about the actual overall achievement of the tax reliefs. And I don't have time to go into that, but I was a little concerned when I read that some of the I suppose not drawbacks, but just it was a little less successful. The evidence for the success of the tax relief was a lot less than I thought it would be when I went to look at the Commission report, let me put it that way. But at the same time, I think on balance, we're in a competitive world. We have to promote the Irish industry, Irish audiovisual industry. As the Commission on Taxation itself says, for example, we're aware of the competitive international environment which exists in the film industry. Ireland competes with other countries and locations for productions, including Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, and so on and so forth. And the Commission on Taxation are acknowledging the role which the sector plays in a significant number of jobs in the economy, and they concluded we consider that film relief should be continued. And I'm delighted with that conclusion. I think that's correct, but it certainly will have to be scrutinised just in the same way we have to scrutinise all of the other reliefs. So on that, I just congratulate the Minister on this piece of legislation and wish him well with it.
Thank you.